In 1347, a ship docked at the port of Messina in Sicily, and when the townspeople boarded to inspect the cargo, they found most of the crew dead. The survivors were covered in black spots and swellings, their bodies racked with fever and pain. No one knew that this single vessel was the harbinger of a catastrophe that would wipe out 1/3 of Europe's population. The Black Death wasn't just a disease, it was a nightmare that brought an entire civilization to its knees, turned people into monsters, and fundamentally changed society forever. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The year was 1347, and Europe was about to face the most devastating pandemic in human history. What started as a distant rumor from the East would soon become an unstoppable force of death that would transform medieval society beyond recognition. This is the story of how ordinary people lived, suffered, and died during the Black Death, and how those who survived were forever changed by the experience. The Black Death didn't arrive quietly. It announced itself with a symphony of horror that began in the bustling trading posts of Asia and slowly crept westward along the Silk Road. By 1346, the disease had already devastated much of Central Asia, leaving entire cities as ghost towns where only the dead remained to tell their stories. The pathogen responsible for this catastrophe was Yersinia pestis, a bacterium that lived in the guts of fleas, which in turn lived on rats. But the people of medieval Europe knew nothing of bacteria or disease vectors. To them, this was either God's wrath or the work of evil spirits, and they were powerless to stop its advance. When infected ships arrived at European ports, they brought more than exotic goods, they brought death itself. The first cases appeared in coastal cities like Messina, Genoa, and Marseille. Within days, what seemed like isolated incidents of strange illness exploded into citywide pandemics that overwhelmed every aspect of daily life. The symptoms were unlike anything physicians had ever encountered. It began innocuously enough, a headache, perhaps some nausea, the kind of minor ailments that people shrugged off as the result of bad air or spoiled food. But within hours, the victim's condition would deteriorate rapidly. Fever would spike to unbearable levels, causing delirium and hallucinations. The patient would vomit blood, their breath becoming foul and labored. Then came the buboes, swollen lymph nodes that grew to the size of apples, primarily in the groin, armpits, and neck. These painful masses would turn black as tissue died, giving the disease its terrifying name. The bubonic form was horrific enough, but there were even worse variants. The pneumonic plague attacked the lungs, causing victims to cough up bloody sputum that could infect anyone within breathing distance. The septicemic form poisoned the blood directly, causing massive internal bleeding and death within hours. For the average medieval European, the speed of the disease was perhaps its most terrifying aspect. A person could wake up healthy in the morning and be dead by nightfall. Families watched helplessly as loved ones transformed from vibrant human beings into corpses in less than a day. The randomness was equally disturbing. The disease seemed to strike without pattern or logic, claiming both the pious and the sinful, the rich and the poor, the young and the old. In cities like Florence, London, and Paris, the death toll climbed so rapidly that normal social structures began to collapse. Merchants abandoned their shops, artisans fled their workshops, and farmers deserted their fields. The carefully maintained hierarchy of medieval society, built on centuries of tradition and mutual obligation, crumbled as everyone focused on the single, overwhelming priority of survival. The economic impact was immediate and devastating. Trade routes that had flourished for centuries ground to a halt as merchants refused to risk contact with potentially infected goods or people. Markets that had once bustled with activity became ghost towns where only the desperate ventured to search for food. Currency became nearly worthless as people hoarded essential supplies rather than engaging in commerce. Communication between cities and regions broke down as messengers and travelers died or refused to risk the journey. News of the plague's progress spread through rumors and panic rather than reliable information. leading to wild speculation about its cause and cure. Some believed it was the end of the world foretold in biblical prophecy. Others suspected it was punishment for humanity's collective sins. The plague moved through Europe with methodical efficiency, following trade routes and rivers, spreading from city to countryside in an inexorable wave of death. It respected no borders, acknowledged no authority, and showed mercy to no one. Within 2 years of its arrival in Europe, the Black Death had penetrated every corner of the continent, from the sophisticated courts of France to the remote villages of Scotland. Rural areas, which initially seemed safer due to their isolation, soon discovered that distance provided no protection. The plague followed the networks of human contact that connected even the most remote communities to the wider world. A single infected traveler, a contaminated grain shipment, or a fleeing family could introduce the disease to previously untouched regions. As the death toll mounted, medieval Europe faced a crisis unlike anything in recorded history. The infrastructure of civilization, government, law enforcement, trade, education, religion began to buckle under the weight of mass mortality. Officials died at their posts, leaving cities without leadership. Priests perished while administering last rites, leaving communities without spiritual guidance. Doctors fled or died, leaving the sick without even the pretense of medical care. The psychological impact was perhaps even more devastating than the physical toll. People lived in constant terror, never knowing if they would wake up the next morning or if their loved ones would survive the day. The normal rhythms of life work, family gatherings, religious observances, seasonal festivals disappeared as communities focused entirely on the grim mathematics of survival. Parents watched their children die and wondered if they had somehow failed to protect them. Children were orphaned by the dozens, left to fend for themselves in a world that had lost its ability to care for the vulnerable. Spouses buried their partners and faced an uncertain future alone. The bonds that held society together, trust, mutual obligation, shared purpose, began to fray as people realized that traditional sources of protection and comfort had proven powerless against this unprecedented catastrophe. When traditional authority failed to provide answers or protection, medieval Europeans turned to increasingly desperate explanations and remedies. The Catholic Church, which had been the unquestioned moral and intellectual authority for centuries, found itself confronting a catastrophe that challenged every aspect of Christian doctrine and practice. Initially, church leaders attempted to frame the plague in familiar theological terms. They proclaimed it was God's punishment for humanity's sins, particularly the sins of pride, greed, and lust that had supposedly corrupted medieval society. Bishops organized massive public prayers, processions, and acts of penance designed to appease divine wrath and convince God to lift the plague. Entire cities would gather in cathedrals and marketplaces to pray collectively, often inadvertently creating perfect conditions for the disease to spread further. But as the death toll continued to climb and prayers seemed to go unanswered, people began to question whether traditional religious responses were adequate. Some took their faith to violent extremes, forming groups of flagellants who wandered from town to town, publicly whipping themselves and others in elaborate displays of penance. These processions drew huge crowds of desperate people seeking any possible relief from the plague's devastation. The flagellant movement represented a dangerous shift in religious authority. Instead of relying on priests and established church hierarchy, these groups claimed direct communication with God and proclaimed that only through extreme physical suffering could humanity earn divine forgiveness. They whipped themselves with chains and scourges until their backs were bloody and raw, believing that their pain could somehow balance the cosmic scales and end the plague. Church officials initially tolerated and even encouraged these displays of public penance, but they soon realized the movement was spiraling beyond institutional control. Flagellant groups began challenging papal authority, claiming they had special insight into God's will that superseded traditional church teaching. They attracted followers who were desperate for any form of hope or explanation, creating alternative power structures that threatened the established religious order. Meanwhile, medical authorities of the time struggled to understand the plague within their limited framework of knowledge. Medieval medicine was based on the ancient Greek theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, which supposedly needed to be kept in balance for health. Physicians believed the plague was caused by corrupted air, or miasma, that threw these humors out of alignment. Treatment methods reflected this fundamental misunderstanding of disease transmission. Doctors recommended bloodletting to rebalance the humors, often weakening patients who desperately needed to maintain their strength. They prescribed bizarre combinations of herbs, minerals, and animal parts as medicines. Some physicians recommended placing emeralds or other precious stones on plague bullets, believing that the stone's supposed mystical properties could draw out the poison. Other treatments were even more outlandish. Some doctors advised patients to sit in sewers, believing that bad smells could counteract the corrupted air that caused the plague. Others recommended surrounding oneself with pleasant aromas like roses or spices, leading to a booming trade in expensive perfumes and incense among those who could afford them. The desperate search for explanations and cures led to increasingly dangerous scapegoating. Unable to comprehend the true cause of the plague, communities began looking for human culprits they could blame and punish. Jewish communities became the primary targets of this misplaced rage, accused of poisoning wells or practicing dark magic to cause the plague. The persecution of Jews during the Black Death was systematic and horrific. Entire Jewish quarters were burned, often with their inhabitants still inside. In some cities, Jewish populations were given the choice between conversion to Christianity or death. Thousands chose death rather than abandon their faith. The violence was so widespread that Pope Clement VI issued a papal bull specifically condemning the persecution, pointing out that Jews were dying from the plague at the same rates as Christians, proving their innocence. But logic had little power against mob fury fueled by desperation and grief. The pogroms continued throughout the plague years, wiping out Jewish communities that had existed for centuries. The economic impact was significant as well, since Jewish communities had often served as moneylenders and merchants in medieval society. Their destruction further destabilized already fragile local economies. Women, particularly those who lived alone or practiced herbal medicine, also became targets of suspicion. The medieval world had always been ambivalent about women who possessed knowledge or independence, and the plague provided an excuse to eliminate those who seemed threatening or different. Accusations of witchcraft multiplied as people searched for supernatural explanations for the unexplainable. Some communities turned to extreme asceticism, believing that earthly pleasures had angered God and brought the plague upon them. They banned music, dancing, colorful clothing, and elaborate foods. Public festivals and celebrations were canceled. Some regions implemented sumptuary laws that forbade displays of wealth or luxury, forcing everyone to dress and behave as if they were in perpetual mourning. Others took the opposite approach, embracing a philosophy of hedonistic abandon. If death could come at any moment without warning, they reasoned, why not enjoy whatever pleasures life could offer? Some people spent their inheritance on lavish feasts and entertainment, believing that tomorrow might never come. This eat, drink, and be merry mentality created its own problems as social norms and moral constraints broke down. The breakdown of normal social controls led to increases in crime and violence. With so many officials dead and legal systems disrupted, some people took advantage of the chaos to settle old scores or enrich themselves at others' expense. Looting became common as people raided the homes of plague victims before authorities could secure their property. Religious extremism flourished in this atmosphere of desperation and social collapse. New mystical movements emerged, often led by charismatic individuals who claimed special revelation about the plague's meaning or methods for ending it. Some preached that the plague marked the beginning of the apocalypse and the imminent return of Christ. Others proclaimed that only through radical poverty and the abandonment of all worldly possessions could humanity hope for salvation. The intellectual community struggled to maintain rational discourse in the face of overwhelming catastrophe. Universities lost students and professors to the plague, disrupting the careful scholarly traditions that had been developing throughout the medieval period. Books and manuscripts were abandoned as their owners fled or died, leading to the loss of valuable knowledge and learning. Medical schools attempted to maintain their teaching programs, but with so many physicians dying while treating plague victims, enrollment plummeted. The few medical texts that addressed the plague were often contradictory or based on classical authorities rather than direct observation, providing little practical guidance for desperate practitioners. By 1351, the worst of the Black Death had passed, but Europe was fundamentally and permanently changed. The continent that emerged from the plague years bore little resemblance to the medieval world that had existed before. The survivors found themselves living in a landscape transformed not just by death, but by the complete reorganization of social, economic, and cultural structures that had seemed permanent and unshakable. The most immediate and visible change was demographic. In some regions, population declined by as much as 60%. Entire villages were abandoned, their houses slowly crumbling as nature reclaimed farmland that had been cultivated for centuries. Travelers passing through formerly prosperous areas reported seeing nothing but empty buildings and overgrown fields, with only the occasional wolf or wild boar as evidence that anything still lived there. The economic consequences were equally dramatic, but more complex than simple decline. While the total economic output of Europe had clearly fallen due to massive population loss, the survivors often found themselves in improved circumstances. With so many people dead, land became plentiful and cheap. Peasants who had previously been bound to tiny plots suddenly had access to much larger holdings. Some abandoned their ancestral villages entirely, moving to better land that had been left vacant by plague victims. The labor shortage created unprecedented opportunities for social mobility. Serfs who had been tied to the land for generations found they could demand wages for their work or simply move to communities that offered better conditions. Lords who had previously commanded absolute authority over their peasants discovered they had to negotiate and make concessions to keep workers on their estates. This shift in economic power led to widespread social unrest. The Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381, though occurring decades after the plague, had its roots in the changed expectations created by post-plague labor shortages. Similar uprisings occurred throughout Europe as traditional authorities struggled to maintain control over populations that had been fundamentally altered by their experience of survival. The craft guilds that had controlled urban economic life also faced transformation. With so many skilled artisans dead, the survivors could command much higher wages and better working conditions. Guild restrictions that had previously limited competition and maintained social hierarchies became difficult to enforce when there were simply too few trained workers to fill essential roles. Women's roles in society expanded out of necessity. With so many men dead, women took over businesses, farms, and households that would previously have been managed exclusively by male family members. Widows, in particular, found themselves with unprecedented economic independence. Some became successful merchants or landowners, challenging traditional assumptions about women's capabilities and appropriate social roles. The religious landscape was equally transformed. The Catholic Church had lost enormous numbers of clergy during the plague years, as priests and monks had continued to administer sacraments and care for the dying even when it meant almost certain death. Entire monasteries had been wiped out. The shortage of educated clergy meant that many parishes went years without regular religious services, leading to the rise of lay religious movements and alternative forms of spiritual expression. The Church's authority had also been damaged by its inability to prevent or explain the plague. People who had watched their priests die alongside everyone else began to question whether the Church really had special access to divine power and protection. This skepticism would eventually contribute to the religious reforms and challenges to papal authority that characterized the later medieval and early modern periods. New forms of popular religion emerged to fill the spiritual void left by institutional disruption. Mystery plays and religious dramas became more common as communities sought ways to express their faith outside of formal church structures. The Dance of Death became a popular artistic motif reflecting the democratizing effect of the plague's indiscriminate killing. Kings and peasants, bishops and beggars were all shown dancing with death as an equal partner. Art and literature of the post-plague period reflected a new preoccupation with mortality and the fragility of human existence. The elegant courtly romances and theological treatises of the pre-plague era gave way to more realistic and often grimmer artistic expressions. Artists began depicting death more frequently and more graphically, creating works that would have been considered morbid or inappropriate in earlier periods. The development of printing technology, which began to spread in the decades following the plague, was partly driven by the need to replace all the books and manuscripts that had been lost when their owners died or libraries were abandoned. The democratization of knowledge through printed books reflected the broader social changes that had resulted from the plague's leveling effect on traditional hierarchies. Medical practice also began to change, though slowly. The obvious failure of traditional treatments during the plague years led some physicians to begin questioning classical authorities and paying more attention to direct observation. While true understanding of disease transmission was still centuries away, the plague experience planted seeds of skepticism about received wisdom that would eventually contribute to more scientific approaches to medicine. Urban planning and public health measures evolved in response to plague experience. Cities began paying more attention to sanitation and waste management, not because they understood disease transmission, but because they associated bad smells and dirty conditions with plague outbreaks. Some communities established the first quarantine systems, isolating travelers from potentially infected areas. The concept of quarantine itself, from the Italian quaranta journey, meaning 40 days, became one of the lasting institutional legacies of the Black Death. Venice and other Italian city-states developed increasingly sophisticated systems for identifying and isolating potentially infectious people and goods, creating the foundations for modern public health practices. International trade eventually resumed, but with new precautions and procedures that reflected hard-learned lessons about the risks of long-distance commerce. Merchants developed new contracts and insurance practices to account for plague-related losses. The great trading companies that emerged in the post-plague period were more centralized and professional than their predecessors, partly because they needed to manage risks that had been unimaginable before. The psychological impact of the plague years created lasting changes in European mentality. People who had lived through the experience of watching their entire world collapse and then slowly rebuild themselves had a different relationship with tradition and authority than their ancestors. They were more skeptical of grand claims and absolute statements, having seen how quickly certainties could disappear. This skepticism extended to political authority as well. Kings and nobles who had proven powerless to protect their subjects from the plague found their legitimacy questioned in new ways. The divine right of kings became harder to maintain when divine intervention had failed so spectacularly to prevent catastrophe. New forms of political organization began to emerge that gave more voice to common people who had proven their worth through survival. The demographic changes created by the plague also had long-term environmental effects. With so much agricultural land abandoned, forests began to reclaim areas that had been farmland for centuries. Wildlife populations that had been under pressure from human expansion began to recover. Some regions experienced what amounted to an ecological reset, returning to something closer to their pre-medieval state. The Black Death was more than just a pandemic. It was a catalyst that transformed medieval Europe into something recognizably modern. The hierarchical, tradition-bound society that had characterized the Middle Ages gave way to a more fluid, questioning, and dynamic culture that would eventually produce the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the early modern world. The survivors of the Black Death had learned that traditional authorities could fail, that social structures could collapse, and that ordinary people could adapt and thrive in circumstances that had seemed impossible. These lessons, burned into European consciousness by the trauma of the plague years, would influence political, social, and cultural developments for centuries to come. In many ways, the Europe that emerged from the Black Death was the first truly modern society, one that understood itself to be fragile, changeable, and ultimately dependent on human rather than divine action for its survival and prosperity. The plague had killed millions, but it had also given birth to a new world. The people who lived through those dark years had paid a terrible price for their transformation, but they had also proven that even the worst catastrophe in human history could not destroy the fundamental human capacity for adaptation, survival, and renewal.